Welcome back to Sleepy Saga Histories, where quiet stories from long ago are told by firelight to help you drift away. Tonight, you'll journey through a forgotten moment in time, a soft thread in the fabric of ancient life, slow and unhurried. Let the day fall away, your breath slow, and if this story keeps you company, you're always welcome back to the fire. The light over Rome crept in slowly, brushing its golden fingertips across the terracotta rooftops and the tiled porticos of the Palatine Hill. The sky was pale and washed with lavender in the earliest hour, and in the upper chambers of a stately domus, the silk hangings stirred gently with the breeze. The city was not yet awake, but one man had already stirred, a senator of Rome. The marble floors were cold beneath his sandaled feet, but he had long grown used to such mornings, silent and still before the bustle. Slipping into his tunic, woven fine and bleached almost bone white, he moved quietly past the sleeping forms of slaves in the side halls. The air smelled faintly of oil and wax, and in the distance a rooster had begun his morning call. His name, forgotten to time, but etched once into stone, was spoken with quiet respect. A man of 60 winters, still sharp of mind, though his beard had greyed. He bore the weight of civic responsibility like a cloak, heavier even than the scarlet-trimmed toga he would don for his day at the Curia. But for now, before Senate walls and oratory duties, there was silence. This was the hour he cherished. The world belonged only to the rustling of trees in the peristyle and the trickle of the household fountain that murmured its welcome. Outside, the light fell through latticed shutters onto frescoed walls, paintings of gods and triumphs, swirling in faded ochres and crimson. He paused there a moment, one hand tracing the outline of Venus rising from the sea, not for piety, but for routine, memory, continuity. His slaves, already moving in rehearsed silence, brought him a small basin of warmed water. He washed slowly, face, hands, arms, then sat by the low table as they offered him figs, a crust of bread, and a dish of soft cheese. Nothing too heavy, nothing luxurious. Roman mornings, he believed, should begin with temperance. As he ate, he listened, not to music or conversation, but to the city itself. The distant clatter of hooves, the call of a market crier echoing faintly over the forum, the hum of Rome awakening. His house overlooked the sacred way, and he could just glimpse a pair of litter-bearers, swaying in rhythm as they carried a noble woman in silk through the pale dawn. All Rome was like this in the early hour, elegant, slow, preparing itself for another day in the empire's heart. When he rose from his seat, a slave approached with his toga. The fabric was heavy, rich with a deep red stripe that marked his station. It took care and precision to wrap it properly, a process requiring another's hands. The senator stood patiently, arms out slightly, as the cloth was draped and folded, looped and tucked in practiced symmetry. The result was both regal and restrictive. The toga was never meant for comfort. It was a statement. With his garments in place, he moved through the inner atrium, past busts of his ancestors, carved in stone with solemn eyes and tight mouths. He paused before one, the likeness of his father, who had sat in the Senate during the reign of Augustus. A flicker of memory passed behind his eyes, but he made no comment. He only nodded once, then turned toward the door. In the vestibulum his bodyguard awaited, one of the stronger slaves, hand-picked, silent. A small escort was already gathered, more for display than defence. Rome was safer now, they said, but he never left unaccompanied. That was not the way of things for a man in his position. Outside, the sun had climbed just above the horizon. The city was alive now. Chariots and ox carts groaning along the stones. Toga-clad men gesturing wildly in debate. Young boys chasing dogs through alleyways. He stepped into the litter, the curtain drawn aside briefly before being pulled shut again, and he began the slow descent toward the forum. Inside it was dim, and the rhythmic sway of the litter lulled him into thought. He reviewed names and matters to address. Land disputes in Etruria, a waterworks proposal near the Aventine, a potential shift in grain prices from Egypt. All would come up in time, but even now, even in this moment of mental preparation, he allowed a fragment of something softer to surface, a memory of boyhood, of playing near the Tiber, of olive groves and sun-warmed stones. He often wondered if the Rome he lived in was the same as the Rome of his youth, or had the city grown harder while he had grown older. He passed beneath the arches near the Basilica Julia, peeking through the curtain. The forum was stirring like a great beast, its limbs stretching, vendors arranging stalls, magistrates hurrying in clusters, philosophers speaking to no one in particular. The Curia stood ahead, its stone facade stern, unyielding. The litter came to rest. A slave pulled back the curtain, and the senator stepped down. The stones of the forum were warm now underfoot. He breathed in deeply. Dust, sweat, olives, incense from a nearby shrine. Rome. He walked steadily up the steps of the Curia, every movement measured. In the shadowed hall, other senators had already begun to gather. Men in similar dress, of similar age and stature. Their voices low, their greetings formal. A murmur of respect passed through them as he entered. He took his seat, folding his toga carefully, and placed his ringed hand on the polished wood of the bench. Another day in service of the Republic, or what remained of it. Another day of debates and alliances, of hidden motives and open rhetoric. And yet in that moment, as the bronze doors closed and the world narrowed to this space of law and tradition, he felt a certain calm. He belonged here. He always had. The chamber of the Curia. Julia was cool in the morning, lit by shafts of pale sunlight that fell between high windows and warmed the stone just enough to remind its occupants that the world outside was alive. The senator sat quietly in his assigned position, surrounded by men whose faces he knew well, some from decades of political alliance, others from rivalry, and a few whose names he still forgot from time to time. They came from noble families, ancient gentes, whose lineages stretched back to the mythical kings of Rome. Names like Cornelius, Fabius, Aemilius, Licinius. To outsiders they were statues, figures of tradition and pride. But here, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Curia, they were still men, with tired eyes and ambitions tucked into every fold of their togas. He adjusted his seat and let his gaze drift across the room. These benches, these walls, had seen centuries of lawmaking. Though this Curia was a rebuilding, commissioned by Julius Caesar himself, decades before, its stones still echoed with voices from Rome's earliest days. The Senate had once met in the Curia Hostilia, a simpler structure, built when the city was still ruled by kings, before the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus, the last monarch. Since then, Rome had called itself a republic. Though the senator thought quietly, some days it didn't quite feel like one. As the meeting was called to order, the voices rose and fell in Latin, measured, cadenced, sometimes passionate. This morning's topics were routine: temple maintenance, oversight of provincial roads, a petition from a disgruntled landowner in Sicily. The senator listened closely, but his mind wandered gently through the centuries, through the invisible threads that tied this moment to everyone before it. He had always been drawn to history, not the dry kind with dates and decrees, but the kind that lived in the streets of Rome itself, in the cracked paving stones, in the soot-stained arches, in the sound of a legion's march echoing through memory. He had stood in this very curia on the day of Emperor Augustus's funeral, the way the crowd had wept, the way the air had felt charged with reverence and anxiety. Augustus had promised peace, and for a while it had come, Pax Romana. The senator had been just a boy then, standing behind his father, clutching the folds of the old man's toga, watching the greatest funeral Rome had ever seen. Now, older than his father had ever been, he could still hear the rustle of laurels and the cry of doves released into the sky. But peace was never permanent in a city like this. Rome was a living creature, built on expansion, ambition and order. And men like him, senators, were its tendons and bones, aging perhaps, but essential. As the discussions turned to the topic of taxation in the provinces, he finally spoke. His voice was low and steady, the kind that made others pause, not because it was forceful, but because it carried weight. He spoke of balance, of duty, of Rome's promise to her allies and subjects, not with flourish, but with experience. When he finished, there was a silence, then the subtle nodding of heads. A small thing, but meaningful. Influence was like smoke. It had to be handled gently. The curia, though grand, was never comfortable. The benches were wooden and hard, the air often still. There were no luxuries here, and yet it was sacred in its own way. A man could speak here and change the course of a province, or a life, or an empire. By midday the formalities had ended, the session adjourned, and the senators drifted out slowly into the brightness of the forum. The sun had risen high now, casting sharp shadows beneath the arches and colonnades. The stone was hot beneath his sandals. He took a moment to stand near the rostra, the great platform from which orators addressed the people. He remembered the stories, how Cicero had once stood here, robes billowing, his voice cutting through the morning air as he denounced conspirators in the Catiline plot. How Mark Antony had read Caesar's will here, turning the city's grief into fury. The stones had absorbed every word. They remembered. He did not speak from the rostra. He had no need to today, but he did pause to run his fingers across its carved edge, worn smooth by time. Then he moved on. He walked slowly now, past the Temple of Saturn with its tall columns and its ancient treasury locked beneath, past the Arch of Septimius Severus, built in celebration of Roman victory over the Parthians. History surrounded him, not just as memory, but as architecture. Every building was a story, every statue a reminder. Rome never let her citizens forget. He turned toward the Basilica Aemilia, where clients sometimes waited for senators to pass, hoping for favour, for sponsorship, for protection. A few men in humble tunics bowed their heads as he passed. He acknowledged them with a small gesture. Such patronage was the blood in Rome's veins. It had been so into the earliest republic, when men of power protected those below them, in exchange for loyalty and often votes. And yet as he walked, he felt the fatigue that age brings, not from walking, but from remembering. So much change, so many emperors, so many laws, And yet, somehow, the rhythms of Rome continued, like the Tiber, slow and inexorable, carving its way through centuries. A slave met him at the edge of the forum with a fresh tunic and water. The senator nodded, took the cup, and drank. There would be no feast today, no grand affair. He had little appetite these days. But there would be a short rest, a moment of quiet before the city called to him again. He turned back toward the sacred way, back toward home, walking slowly under the gaze of marble gods who had watched 1,000 men like him rise and age and fade. The sun was beginning to tilt westward as the senator returned to his domus. The sacred way shimmered underfoot, its stones smooth from generations of sandals and cartwheels. The hum of the forum faded behind him, replaced by the quieter murmurs of residential Rome, vendors calling softly, slaves tending gardens behind porticos, the clatter of amphora being loaded into kitchens. His villa stood among others, of his rank, along the slope of the Palatine Hill, shaded by cypress trees and bounded by high walls of warm stucco and brick. These homes were not just dwellings, they were symbols, places of lineage, of public image, of ancestral pride. The wooden doors of the villa swung open at his approach. A doorman bowed low, and inside a slave handed him a clean linen cloth for his face and neck, damp and cool with rose water. It was a small comfort, but one long embedded in the rituals of Roman elite life. Cleanliness, or at least the appearance of it, was a virtue expected of men in his position. Roman values prized gravitas, dignity, restraint, and while luxury was tolerated, even celebrated, it had to be worn like armour, with control. He stepped into the atrium, where sunlight fell through the open compluvium, lighting the still pool of the impluvium below. The walls around him were painted with deep reds and ochres, figures of myth and victory caught in scenes that danced just above the eyeline. This atrium, like so many in Roman homes, was built to impress. The eyes of guests were meant to linger here. It was here that the senator's ancestors were remembered, in wax masks stored in cupboards behind the tablinum, brought out for funerals and processions, worn by actors who walked silently behind the coffins of their descendants, ensuring their memory lived with every footstep. The house was quiet now. The slaves moved carefully, their footsteps hushed against the tiled floors. There had been a time when his children's voices echoed through these halls. Boys with wooden swords, girls reciting lines from Virgil's Aeneid. Now they were grown, scattered across the provinces and the capital, pursuing lives of their own. One son had gone to Alexandria, another served as a legate in Hispania. His daughter had married a senator of equal standing, her letters full of news about their children and the shifting dynamics of court life. He passed through the atrium to the peristyle garden, where trimmed box hedges framed a small fountain in the shape of a nymph. A few sparrows flitted in the lemon trees above. Here, surrounded by the scent of herbs and shaded by a tiled colonnade, he sat for a moment, listening. Rome was never silent, not truly, but in these gardens the noise softened to a kind of heartbeat. Lunch was light, bread, olives, some cheese from a nearby estate, and fresh figs split open with honey. He ate little, as always, more out of habit than hunger. His steward approached after the meal with a small tablet, notes from friends, requests for favours, a schedule for the next day, a patronage request from a young equestrian seeking support for his judicial post, an invitation to a private recitation by a poet of some note. a reminder of a temple dedication in 2 days' time, near the Forum Boreum. The senator took the tablet in hand and dismissed the steward. These decisions could wait. The heat of the afternoon was rising, and with it came the city's lull. Merides, the quiet hours. In Rome, everything slowed under the midday sun. Merchants pulled canvas awnings taut. Bathhouses emptied. The streets emptied of senators, who retreated to their homes to rest. He made his way to the study, the tablinum, and paused to look at the shelves. Scrolls neatly stacked, sealed letters bound in twine. A bust of Cato the Elder watching sternly from a pedestal. He passed a hand along the marble cheek, not out of superstition, but respect. Cato, the model of Roman virtue, had scorned extravagance, demanded austerity, and devoted himself to the Republic with a ferocity that still echoed in Senate speeches centuries later. On a small desk near the window lay a half-written letter to his son, the one in Hispania, who had recently written of unrest along the border and the weariness of campaign life. The senator smiled faintly, remembering his own years posted in distant provinces, dusty roads, the weight of command, the delicate act of balancing Roman order with local autonomy. You could not rule through cruelty alone. Rome's greatest strength had always been its ability to absorb cultures, gods, languages. It offered roads, laws, and citizenship in return for loyalty. And yet peace was never simple. He sat quill in hand, but did not write. Instead his gaze drifted to the open window, where the shadows were beginning to stretch and soften. He thought of the baths. Perhaps he would go later. Not to socialise, as he once did in his younger years, but to soak in the warm tepidarium, to feel the marble beneath his feet, and the steam ease the stiffness in his joints. There was a rhythm to the Roman day, and for men of his standing, the baths were part of it. They were not just for cleansing. They were political spaces, gossip halls, forums in miniature. But now he preferred the quieter hours, when most had left and the air was thick with silence. As the late afternoon crept onward, a slave appeared silently in the doorway. The senator rose slowly, nodding his thanks, and moved again toward the garden, toward the final hours of light, where history settled around him like a warm mantle. The sun began its slow descent beyond the Janiculum hill, and the sky over Rome turned the colour of crushed terracotta. Shadows grew longer across the garden colonnade as the senator sat beneath its arch, a woolen wrap now draped across his shoulders to guard against the soft chill that crept into the stones at dusk. The gentle clatter of ceramic cups echoed faintly from within the villa, slaves preparing for the evening meal, moving carefully so as not to disturb the calm. Before dining, the senator stood and slowly made his way toward the bath complex within his domus. Not all Roman homes had such a luxury, but he had long ago commissioned a modest series of chambers with a small apoditerium, a tepidarium, and a single marble-lined caldarium. It lacked the grand columns and gilded ceilings of the public thermae, but it was quiet, an oasis carved from the heart of his estate. A slave met him at the threshold with a soft linen towel and a jar of oil. The senator undressed with practised slowness, folding his garments over a stool and stepping into the warm embrace of the tepidarium. Steam clung to the walls like silk. He sat on a low bench, letting the heat rise around his limbs, drawing from him the weight of the day. Not so much physical exertion, but the subtler burdens of thought, speech, and restraint. Rome's political dance required endless balance, One could not push too far, nor yield too easily. Pride and humility were worn in tandem. He moved next into the caldarium, where the heat embraced him more fully, and the scent of eucalyptus oil hung in the air. It was here he allowed himself stillness. Outside, Rome's streets were still busy, vendors hawking late-day goods, beggars chanting prayers at the steps of temples, children darting between columns with the last of their laughter. But within these walls, all was muffled, softened by the marble and the mist. After a time, he was scraped gently with a strigil, the curved bronze tool used to clean away the mixture of oil and dirt. A slave performed the task with care and familiarity, their movements precise, respectful, anonymous. In this private realm, hierarchy was both present and quietly dissolved. All Romans bathed, all were reduced to bare skin in the steam, but status still whispered in the architecture, in the silence, in the presence of servants rather than strangers. Cleansed and robed, the senator returned to the main part of the house. The lamps had been lit, bronze figures holding shallow bowls of oil, their wicks glowing with steady amber light. The triclinium, his dining room, was modest by senatorial standards. 3 couches arranged in a U-shape, low tables between them, walls painted with mythic scenes in soft fading colours. Tonight he would dine alone, though occasionally he entertained visiting magistrates or fellow senators. These dinners were never purely social. In Rome, even meals served politics. A single course was brought first, lentils stewed with cumin and a splash of vinegar, served with barley bread and a drizzle of garum, Rome's ubiquitous fermented fish sauce, whose scent was as defining to the city as the Forum itself. Then came roast duck with dates and a few sweetened figs from a nearby orchard. A slave poured watered wine into a polished cup and retreated soundlessly into the shadows. The senator ate slowly, thoughtfully. He had never much liked lavish feasts. He remembered one banquet years ago, under Caligula's reign, where dishes had been dusted with gold leaf and guests had been seated among live flamingos. Excess, he believed, dulled the senses. True Roman strength came from temperance, moderatio, a word as valued as any victory. As the meal ended, he leaned back upon the couch, watching the flicker of the oil lamp cast shadows along the frescoed walls. One panel showed the god Mercury delivering a message, winged sandals barely grazing the earth. Another depicted Odysseus before Circe, his hand outstretched, wary yet drawn forward. The myths were not just decoration, they reminded the viewer through symbol and echo that power, cunning, patience and wisdom had always been part of the Roman soul. A slave entered again with a small scroll, a report from the grain markets. Prices were rising slightly. The senator scanned it, nodding. Rome's lifeblood came from distant fields, Egypt, Sicily, North Africa, and the men who controlled those routes held invisible but immense power. As a member of the Annona, Rome's Grain Oversight Committee, he took this responsibility seriously. A shortage could lead to panic. Panic could lead to unrest. And unrest, even in whispers, could stir something darker in the people. He set the scroll aside and walked out once more to the peristyle, where the moon now hung above the garden wall like a silver coin, forgotten in the sky. The fountain trickled softly, echoing through the lemon trees. He breathed in the cool night air. Somewhere beyond the city, the legions stood guard along distant borders. Senators debated in marble halls. Slaves lit lamps in alleyways. And Rome, the living city, the eternal city, murmured in its sleep. He stood there for a long while, wrapped in silence, until the cold touched his bones again. With one last glance at the stars, he turned back inside, toward his bedchamber, where another day's ending awaited him with the calm assurance of ritual. The senator's footsteps were slow as he crossed the polished floor of the tablinum, his shadow long beneath the flickering torchlight. The gentle hush of evening had settled fully over the villa. Outside, Rome exhaled. Distant voices still carried faintly. A fruit vendor closing up his stall, the soft tapping of a servant's sandals against a side street, the occasional bark of a tethered dog disturbed by night sounds. But within the house, all movement now belonged to ritual. He passed into the cubiculum, his sleeping chamber, where the air was still and faintly perfumed with crushed laurel leaves placed earlier beneath the window by a thoughtful slave. The room was simple, yet dignified. A wooden bed with tightly bound ropes beneath a wool-stuffed mattress, a low chest containing his personal seals and tablets, a small writing table in the corner with a half-burnt candle dripping wax down its clay holder. The walls bore faded frescoes of pastoral scenes, quiet shepherds beneath cypress trees, cattle resting by a river's edge, images chosen not for wealth, but for calm. He lowered himself carefully onto the bed, the day's weight slowly leaving his shoulders. A slave approached silently with a bronze basin and jug. The senator held out his hands, and warm water trickled over his fingers. It was not merely cleanliness, it was custom. To wash before sleep was as Roman as the Forum. Another slave followed with a light wool blanket, setting it gently across him. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The rhythm of the villa was a song everyone knew. He lay back and let his gaze rest on the beams above, following the grain of the old wood as his mind wandered. He thought of his youth, once full of ambition and rhetoric, when his toga still felt new and his voice rang with the idealism of Cato. He remembered his father's advice. The state is not the Senate, it is the silence between its words. He hadn't understood it then, but now he did. Power wasn't always in motion. Often it was in the stillness between laws, in the quiet glance across the curia, in the whispered agreement behind closed doors. A breeze passed through the window slats, fluttering the edge of a curtain. It smelled faintly of smoke and fig leaves. Somewhere beyond the villa, a litter passed by. He could hear the clink of bronze fittings and the faint grunt of a bearer. Perhaps another senator returning late from a gathering, or a magistrate finishing business at a friend's domus. Even at night, Rome moved. He reached to his side, retrieving a small wax tablet, thumbing open the wooden cover. By habit, he recorded a few brief reflections from each day. Nothing formal, just scattered notes, a comment made by a consul, the mannerisms of a young orator, the posture of a foreign envoy. Rome taught its men to watch. Observing was survival. The stylus etched softly into the wax as the senator made a few quiet remarks. A flick of the wrist, and the words disappeared beneath a fresh smear of the smooth surface to be rewritten tomorrow. Then at last he extinguished the candle with a gentle pinch of the fingers. Darkness settled over the room. Not the harsh black of closed eyes, but a warm shadow broken only by the moonlight slipping through the shutter slats, forming thin silver stripes across the stone floor. The fire in the atrium had long since been banked. The servants were tucked away in their quarters. Only the house's breath remained. Wood creaking, fabric shifting, the occasional settling of tile upon tile. The senator closed his eyes, his breath deepening. His body knew the rhythm now. Early mornings, long discussions, quiet meals, careful alliances, the endless hum of responsibility. But here, in sleep, those burdens fell away. His mind turned to more ancient things, childhood hills, games played along the Tiber, the sound of cicadas in fields now paved over by empire. As he drifted further, dreams stirred at the edges of his thoughts, not the vivid dreams of youth, nor the frantic ones of ambition. These were quieter, shaped by memory and scent. He saw his mother's hands folding a tunic, heard his tutor's voice reciting Virgil beneath a fig tree, felt the warm stone of the forum beneath his bare feet before his first toga was ever worn. The city outside slumbered with him. Temples cast long silhouettes against the starlight. The aqueducts, ever flowing, carried the heartbeat of Rome across its hills and valleys. Somewhere, an old philosopher still spoke softly to his pupils under torchlight. Somewhere, a thief slipped through alleyways, and a sentry yawned at his post. The empire did not sleep all at once. But within this domus, beneath the blanket, within the quiet folds of a senator's night, the Roman soul rested. And as the moon passed overhead, casting light on roof tiles and silent corridors, Rome waited. For another dawn, another Senate session, another whispered bargain. But for now, only breath and memory remained. The hours drifted onward, unnoticed by the sleeping villa. Through the high atrium window, the stars began to fade, first one, then another, dissolving into the dull grey of pre-dawn light. The senator stirred beneath his blanket, eyes fluttering open, not from noise or urgency, but from years of discipline, an internal rhythm trained to meet the day before it asked for him. For a moment, he did not rise. He lay still, letting his gaze rest on the slow brightening beams above, letting his thoughts remain untethered. Outside, Rome stirred. Slowly, a cart creaked along the stones, its wheels echoing softly down the empty road. A pair of doves cooed from the rooftop tiles, silhouetted against the pale blush of morning. A slave moved through the garden, brushing dew from the walkway with a silent broom. These were not the clamouring sounds of midday chaos, but the softened breaths of an ancient city waking from slumber. The senator sat up, his joints stiff but familiar. He rubbed his brow with 2 fingers, felt the line of his years, and exhaled through his nose in a quiet sigh. Another day, another chance to speak measured words, to guard against hasty tongues, to write with purpose, to watch without seeming to. Rome would ask no less. He dressed slowly, wrapping his tunic, tightening his cincture, sliding his feet into soft leather sandals, worn smooth with age. His toga would wait until later. Its careful folds demanded attention, and the moment did not yet call for ceremony. For now, he stepped out into the peristyle garden, arms folded behind his back, head turned toward the pale light spilling across the columns. The lemon trees trembled gently in the breeze. The fountain had resumed its trickle, fed by the hidden cistern that never slept. A small bird hopped along the rim, dipping its beak, unbothered by the quiet presence of the man in white. He watched it, unmoving. There were lessons in stillness. Rome had taught him that. Not every move was action. Sometimes presence alone could carry the weight of intent. A slave entered the garden with a polished scroll case. Another petition from a minor magistrate. Another land dispute between clients in Ostia. Another letter from a cousin in Cisalpine Gaul, bemoaning the price of olives. The senator took the scroll, nodded once, and gestured to leave it on the stone bench. He would read it in time, but not yet. His mind returned to the years behind him. Campaigns of rhetoric, alliances carefully tended, the long afternoons seated beneath the curia's vaulted roof, debating grain supplies, temple funds, and foreign envoys. He had known triumphs, yes, and losses. He had seen laws passed by a breath and reversed by a storm. He had buried friends whose names once rang like trumpets through the forum, now spoken only in quiet toasts and fading inscriptions. Yet still, Rome endured. Beyond his garden wall, the same sun was lighting the same stones that Scipio had walked. The same breeze stirred the cloaks of traders and senators alike. The same river moved slowly past the 7 hills, carrying time with it. And in that moment, he felt it. Not pride, not regret, but a quiet belonging. He had lived a Roman life, not a perfect one, not always noble, but it had been steeped in the rhythm of this place, in its rituals, its contradictions, its shadows, and its brilliance. And for that, he was content. He turned at last and moved back into the house. The day would begin again. He would eat, dress, hear petitions, advise, listen. He would be seen and unseen. And when the sun fell once more beyond the Janiculum, he would return to this same garden and breathe the same air and know that Rome continued. Not because of any one man, but because of the countless quiet lives that upheld it. And so ended a day in the life of a Roman senator, not with triumph or tragedy, but with continuity, with routine, with the soft endurance that outlives empire, with the slow, steady rhythm of a world held together by memory and duty, and by men who carried it forward, one quiet day at a time. Good night.